The night Miss Cecily Barrow mispronounced the Duke of Ashford's title, 34 people laughed. She counted them. Later, alone in the carriage with her hands still trembling in her lap, she counted every single face that had turned toward her, every open mouth, every raised eyebrow, every gloved hand lifted to conceal a smile that wasn't concealed at all. 34. She would not forget a single one. But the Duke did not laugh. He sat at the head of his magnificent table in his magnificent house, surrounded by the most polished people in England, and he did not so much as smile. He looked at her, just looked. And then, without raising his voice, without moving from his chair, he did something that silenced every one of those 34 people in the span of a single breath. No one spoke of it afterward. That was the strange thing. 34 people witnessed it, and not one of them mentioned it again. Not at supper, not in the carriage's home, not in the drawing rooms the following morning where everything else about that evening was picked apart with great enthusiasm. Some moments are too sharp to touch. Cecily would spend the next several weeks trying to forget his face in that moment. She would fail, completely and without dignity, every single time. The invitation had arrived on a Tuesday, addressed in careful copperplate to Miss Arabella Barrow, and it had sat on the silver tray in the hallway of Barrow House like a small, cream-colored miracle. Arabella had read it twice, set it down, and said nothing for the remainder of the afternoon. That in itself should have been a warning. Arabella was not a woman who said nothing. Arabella filled rooms with her laugh, with her opinions, with the particular energy of someone who had always understood, instinctively and without effort, exactly where she belonged. When Arabella went quiet, something was wrong. Cecily noticed. She always noticed things about Arabella, the way younger sisters notice everything about older ones, cataloging, comparing, measuring the distance between what they are and what they are supposed to become. She noticed the set of Arabella's shoulders at dinner that evening. She noticed the untouched food on her plate. She noticed that Arabella excused herself early and did not come down again. She did not ask. That was her first mistake. By Thursday, Arabella had a cough. By Friday, the cough had become, according to their father, a complete and utter impossibility. Sir Edmund Barrow delivered this verdict at breakfast, standing at the head of the table with the invitation in one hand and a piece of toast in the other, as though the two were equally important, which, for Sir Edmund, they likely were. "You'll go instead," he said. Cecily looked up from her tea. "I beg your pardon." "The Duke of Ashford's dinner, Saturday evening. Arabella cannot go, so you will." He said it the way he said most things, with the air of a man who had already moved on to the next thought and simply needed the room to catch up. Sir Edmund Barrow was not a cruel man, precisely. He was something harder to name and in many ways harder to bear. A man who loved his daughters in the abstract and managed them in the particular with the same brisk efficiency he applied to his estates and his accounts. Cecily had stopped expecting warmth from him years ago. What she had not stopped expecting, foolishly, was consideration. "I don't know the Duke," she said. "He doesn't know you either. That's hardly the point." "What is the point?" Her father set down the invitation and looked at her for the first time that morning, really looked, the way he occasionally did when she surprised him, which she gathered was not often enough to have become habit. "Lord Pemberton will be there," he said, "and Viscount Carey, and at least 4 other men whose acquaintance it would be very much in this family's interest to cultivate." He picked up his toast again. "You are 23 years old, Cecily. These opportunities do not arrange themselves." She wanted to say several things. She said none of them. Upstairs, she knocked on Arabella's door. "Come in," Arabella said, and her voice was perfectly clear, entirely uncongested, and gave no indication whatsoever of a woman suffering from any ailment more serious than inconvenience. Cecily stepped inside and closed the door behind her. Arabella was sitting at her dressing table, not ill, not resting, but reading a letter from the look of it, though she folded it quickly when she saw Cecily's face. "You're not sick," Cecily said. Arabella met her eyes in the mirror. "No." "Then why?" "Because I am not going to that house." Arabella set the folded letter in her lap and smoothed it once with her palm, a gesture that looked less like tidiness and more like something being held down. "And you shouldn't either, but father won't listen to me, so." She turned around on the stool. "Wear the blue dress, not the gray. And for heaven's sake, Cecily, don't let anyone seat you near Lady Fiona Ashworth if you can help it." "Who is Lady Fiona Ashworth?" Arabella looked at her for a long moment. Something moved across her face, not quite pity, not quite guilt, but something in the vicinity of both. "You'll know her when you see her," she said. "Everyone does." Cecily waited for more. More did not come. She wore the blue dress. It was the right color but the wrong season for Ashford Park's drafty corridors, and by the time the carriage arrived and she stepped out into the October evening, she was already cold and already certain that she had made some fundamental error she could not yet identify. The house was enormous. Of course it was. She had known it would be enormous. Everyone knew Ashford Park, even people who had never been within 20 miles of it, but knowing and standing before it were entirely different experiences. The lights blazing from its windows made it look less like a home and more like a statement. A reminder, perhaps, of what certain families had been for 300 years and intended to go on being indefinitely. A footman took her cloak. Another directed her toward the drawing room where the guests were assembling before dinner. She followed the sound of voices, the clink of crystal, the bright, practiced laughter of people who had been doing this long enough that it no longer required effort. She stopped in the doorway. 34 people. She did not count them then, that came later. But she felt them, the way you feel a room that has its own temperature, its own atmosphere, its own set of rules that everyone inside already knows and no one has thought to write down. Silks and satins caught the candlelight. Jewels winked at throats and wrists. Conversations moved in smooth, overlapping currents, each one perfectly calibrated, each one entirely certain of its own importance. And at the far end of the room, standing slightly apart from the rest with a glass he had not touched, and an expression that suggested he found the entire proceedings faintly absurd, was a man she did not need to be introduced to. She knew him the way you know a fact you've carried for years without ever quite examining it. The Duke of Ashford was 31, unmarried, and reportedly the coldest man in 3 counties. She had heard it said at enough dinners, other dinners, smaller dinners, the kind she actually belonged at, that his manner could lower the temperature of a room by several degrees, that he was brilliant and particular and utterly indifferent to what anyone thought of him, that he had turned down more eligible matches than most men received in a lifetime, and shown no signs of regretting a single one. He was also, she noted with a kind of detached helplessness, extraordinarily good-looking. This seemed deeply unfair. He did not look at her. She was grateful for that. She found a place near the window and stayed there until dinner was announced, speaking to no one, being spoken to by no one, and cataloging every exit in the room out of habit. Then the doors to the dining room opened, and a woman in dark green silk turned from across the room, met Cecily's eyes, and smiled the particular smile of someone who has already decided exactly what you are and found it amusing. Lady Fiona Ashworth. Cecily didn't need to ask, she knew. She straightened her spine, lifted her chin, and walked toward the dining room. The evening, she understood, was just beginning. The dining room at Ashford Park was the kind of room that made you aware of your own smallness. Not cruelly. That was the thing about true grandeur. It didn't need to be cruel. It simply existed, in the height of the ceilings and the depth of the silver, and the particular quality of the candlelight that fell across 34 faces, arranged along a table that could have seated 20 more without inconvenience. Cecily took her seat somewhere in the middle. between a baronet's wife who smelled of lavender and a gentleman who had already refilled his wine glass twice before the first course arrived, and told herself, firmly and without much conviction, that she was perfectly fine. She was not perfectly fine. She was cold and underdressed, and acutely conscious of the fact that the woman 3 seats to her left had not stopped looking at her since they sat down. Lady Fiona Ashworth, up close, was even more arresting than she had been across the drawing room, dark-haired, pale-skinned, possessed of the kind of beauty that had clearly been managed and maintained with the same seriousness that other women applied to their finances. She wore her green silk like armor. She wore her smile the same way. Cecily looked away first. She suspected Lady Fiona had never looked away first in her life. The first course came and went. Cecily ate carefully and said little and listened to everything, which had always been her particular skill, the skill of someone who had spent most of her life in rooms where she was not quite the intended audience. The baronet's wife discussed a recent engagement in Somerset. The twice-wine gentleman offered opinions on the hunting season that no one had solicited. Somewhere to Cecily's right, a conversation about continental fashions was becoming unexpectedly heated. The Duke said almost nothing. He sat at the head of the table with the quiet authority of a man who understood that his silence carried more weight than anyone else's words, and he ate his dinner, and occasionally inclined his head at something said near him, and mostly he looked at the middle distance with an expression that Cecily, studying him in the brief, careful glances she allowed herself, could only describe as contained. He was not bored exactly. He was somewhere further than bored, somewhere past it, on the other side of it, in a country that boredom had long since stopped visiting. She had almost convinced herself that he hadn't noticed her at all. Then the second course arrived, and the baronet's wife turned to speak to someone on her other side, and the twice-wine gentleman became absorbed in his plate, and the particular current of noise that had been shielding Cecily shifted, the way currents do, without warning and without apology. And the Duke looked at her. Not a glance, not the polite, sliding acknowledgement that guests exchanged across long tables when conversation required it. He looked at her the way she had caught him looking at the middle distance earlier, with attention, with something deliberate behind it, except now that attention was directed entirely at her, and Cecily felt it the way you feel a change in weather, in your chest, before your mind has caught up. "Miss Barrow," he said. The table did not go quiet, not yet, but something shifted in it, the way a flock of birds shifts before it turns, some collective, unspoken awareness that something was happening. "Yes," Cecily said, and then, because silence seemed insufficient and her mouth had apparently decided to act independently of her better judgment, she added, "Your Grays." For one merciful half-second, she didn't realize what she'd said. Then she did. It moved through her like cold water, that particular specific horror of a mistake you cannot take back, cannot soften, cannot reframe as anything other than what it is. Your Grays. Not your Grace, not the correct, perfectly ordinary two-syllable address she had used in her head a dozen times on the carriage ride over. Your Grays, like a field, like livestock, like someone who had never in her life sat at a table with a duke and had just proven it beyond all possible doubt. The table went quiet. And then it didn't. The laugh started somewhere to her left. She thought it was Lady Fiona, though she would never be entirely certain, because by the time the sound registered it had already spread, moving down both sides of the table with the speed and enthusiasm of something that had been waiting for exactly this permission. Not everyone laughed, but enough did. Enough that the sound filled the room, bright and sharp, and just long enough to ensure that no one at that table for the rest of the evening would think of anything else. Cecily did not move. This was not bravery. This was the specific paralysis of someone whose body has understood, before the mind has, that there is nowhere to go. She sat with her hands in her lap and her spine very straight, and her eyes fixed on the middle distance, on the particular square of white tablecloth between her plate and the next, and she breathed, and she did not cry, and she did not stand up, and she counted without meaning to the voices around her. She had reached 12 when the laughter stopped. Not tapered, not faded, stopped all at once as though someone had closed a hand around it. She looked up. The Duke had not moved. He was still in his chair, still at the head of his table, still holding the same glass he had not touched all evening. He had not raised his voice. He had not spoken. He had simply looked down the length of the table, across all 34 of his guests, with an expression that Cecily could not name because she had never seen it before on anyone's face, let alone a Duke's. It was not anger. It was something quieter than anger and considerably more dangerous. The room understood it before she did. The room had known this man for years. The silence was absolute. Then he turned to her, only to her, and when he spoke, his voice was perfectly level, perfectly unhurried, and pitched exactly loud enough for every person at that table to hear without effort. "I believe, Miss Barrow," he said, "that is the most honest thing anyone has said at this table in years." No one laughed, no one spoke, no one, as far as Cecily could tell, breathed. She looked at him. He looked at her. And in the space between those two facts, something happened that she would spend a very long time trying to describe to herself with any accuracy. Some small, silent, entirely private thing, like a door opening in a room you didn't know existed. She had no idea what he meant. She suspected, from the expressions around her, that neither did anyone else. But his eyes, when they held hers, were not cold at all. They were, underneath everything, underneath the stillness and the authority and the particular containment of a man who had spent his entire life being watched, almost warm. Then he looked away. The table resumed, carefully, quietly, like a clock being wound again after a long stillness. Conversations restarted. Cutlery moved. The twice-wine gentleman refilled his glass for the third time and said something about the hunting season that no one heard. Cecily looked back down at her plate. Her hands, she noticed, had stopped trembling. She did not count what happened next. She did not need to. She simply sat and ate and listened and let the evening continue around her, and underneath the cold and the embarrassment and the persistent, low hum of mortification that she suspected would follow her home in the carriage and up the stairs and into sleep, there was something else. Something she couldn't name yet. Something that felt, against all available evidence and every reasonable expectation, like the beginning of something. She found the library by accident. This was, in retrospect, entirely her own fault. When dinner finally ended, and the guests redistributed themselves between the drawing room and the card tables with the practiced ease of people who had done this 100 times before, Cecily had followed the general current of movement, turned left when she should have turned right, and walked through a door that looked, in the dim corridor light, very much like the one everyone else had used. It was not the same door. She realized this approximately 4 steps in, when the sounds of the party, the laughter, the music someone had begun on the pianoforte, the particular percussion of an evening in full, confident motion, became muffled and then distant, and then gone entirely, replaced by the deep, specific quiet of a room that was used to silence and preferred it. The library at Ashford Park was not a decorative library. Cecily had been in decorative libraries, rooms where books were arranged by color or height, and served primarily as evidence of taste rather than reading. This was not that. This was a room that had been lived in, worked in, thought in. The shelves ran floor to ceiling on 3 walls, interrupted only by a fireplace that still held the warmth of a fire recently banked, and the books on those shelves were not arranged for appearance. They were arranged by someone who needed to find things. Some were marked with slips of paper. Some were stacked horizontally on top of the vertical rows, the overflow of a collection that had long since exceeded its original intentions. Cecily stood in the middle of the room and forgot, for a moment, that she was lost. She moved to the nearest shelf without deciding to. Her fingers found the spine of a volume, Natural History, from the look of it, and she was just reading the title when the door opened behind her. She turned. The Duke of Ashford stood in the doorway with his jacket still on, and his cravat slightly loosened, and the expression of a man who had come here for quiet and found, instead, a woman from dinner touching his books. Cecily took her hand off the shelf. "I apologize," she said immediately. "I took the wrong corridor I was looking for." She stopped. She was not entirely sure what she had been looking for. "I'll go." She moved toward the door. He didn't move away from it. Not blocking it, there was room enough to pass. But he didn't step aside either, and something in his stillness made her stop before she reached him. "How did you find it?" he said. She blinked. "I told you I took the wrong." "The library." He glanced past her at the shelves, and something in his expression shifted, loosened, slightly, the way a held breath loosens. Most people who take a wrong turn find the portrait gallery or the music room. They don't find this. "I followed the quiet," Cecily said, before she had considered whether that was a sensible thing to say. He looked at her. "So did I," he said. He came into the room then, and she stayed, and neither of them made a decision about it. It simply happened the way certain things happen in certain rooms, when the rest of the world is on the other side of a door, and the fire is warm, and the hour is late enough that ordinary social mathematics stop applying quite so strictly. He didn't sit. He stood at the shelf across from her and pulled a book without looking at the title and turned it in his hands and said, "You're not from London." "No," Cecily said, "Wiltshire." "You came up for the season." "I came up for this dinner." She paused. "The invitation was my sister's." He glanced at her. "And your sister decided not to come." "Wise woman," he said, with a flatness that sounded less like insult and more like honesty, and Cecily looked at him and felt, unexpectedly, the precise sensation of understanding someone. "Is it always like this?" she asked. "Your dinners?" "Always." He set the book back on the shelf. "You learn to manage it." "You didn't look like you were managing it. You looked like you were enduring it." The silence that followed this was the kind that could have gone very badly. Cecily was aware of this. She was also aware that she had said it anyway, and that she did not, upon reflection, entirely regret it. The Duke looked at her for a long moment. "Yes," he said simply, "that's closer." They talked. She could not afterward have said exactly how long. Long enough for the fire to settle once more, and for the sounds from the party to shift from lively to winding down. He asked about Wiltshire, not politely, not to fill space, but because he had apparently spent 3 weeks there some years ago and retained specific opinions about the landscape that he seemed genuinely interested in comparing against hers. She told him about the way the light fell across the downs in October, and the particular stubbornness of the local soil, and a library in the nearest market town that had 17 books on astronomy and nothing at all on agriculture, which struck her as a missed opportunity. He listened the way very few people listened, without preparing his response while she spoke, without glancing toward the door, without the faint performance of attention that most people substituted for the real thing. It was, she thought, the strangest conversation she had ever had, and the most natural. She was reaching for the Natural History volume again when her hand stopped. The book beside it was thin, almost pamphlet thin, and it was shelved slightly out of alignment with its neighbors, as though it had been recently replaced in haste. That was not what stopped her. What stopped her was the small marking on the spine, not a printed title but a handwritten letter in faded ink. B***. She stared at it. "Miss Barrow." She looked up. The Duke was watching her with the particular attention he seemed to apply to things that surprised him. "That book," she said slowly, "the one with the initial." He followed her gaze. Something moved across his face, brief, controlled, but there. Yes. What does the B stand for? A pause, not a long one, but deliberate. It belonged to my father, he said. He marked his personal correspondence that way, letters he considered worth keeping. May I? She stopped herself. I'm sorry, that's not appropriate. No, he said, and then after a moment in a different tone entirely, but take it down. She did. It was not a book. It was a collection of letters, folded and bound with a thin piece of ribbon the color of which had long since faded to something between ivory and gray. The handwriting on the outermost letter was a woman's, careful, considered, and entirely legible. The name on it was not a name she expected. It was her mother's name. She looked up at the Duke. He was watching her with an expression she could not read, not because it was hidden, but because it contained too many things at once. You knew, she said. I knew the name, he said carefully. I didn't know you. How long have you known the name? Long enough. He exhaled slowly, and for the first time all evening, he looked like something other than a man in complete control of himself. He looked like a man standing at the edge of something he had been approaching for a long time and had not quite prepared himself to reach. My father spoke of her, not often, but when he did, it was differently than he spoke of other things. Cecily looked down at the letters in her hands. Her mother had died when she was 11. She had left behind a few dresses, a small portrait, and a habit of saying that kindness cost nothing that Cecily had carried like a borrowed coat ever since. She had not left behind any mention of a Duke's father. She had not left behind any explanation for why her name was written in faded ink in a library in Ashford Park. I think, Cecily said slowly, that I need to read these. I think, the Duke said, that you do. She read the outermost letter standing up, by the firelight, with the Duke 3 feet away and not pretending not to watch her. It was short. It was her mother's handwriting. She recognized it from old birthday notes kept in a box under her bed at home, and it was addressed to a man she now understood had spent years keeping this particular piece of paper. Her mother had refused a proposal. She had done it gently, carefully, with the full weight of a woman who understood what she was refusing and had chosen to refuse it anyway. And at the end of the letter, in the last paragraph, in handwriting that pressed slightly harder into the page as though the words required more force to commit to. If I am ever so fortunate as to have a daughter, I pray she finds her way into the world more gracefully than I have managed. And if the world is unkind to her, as it so often is to women who do not know to make themselves smaller, I hope she finds somewhere someone who sees what I see when I look at her, not what she lacks, what she carries. Cecily folded the letter. She did not cry. She was aware distantly that she wanted to and that she would later in the carriage in the particular privacy of motion and darkness, but not here, not now. She looked at the Duke. He was watching her with an expression she could read now, clearly and without difficulty, because she had stopped trying to classify it and simply let it be what it was. He was sorry, and he was glad she was here, both things at once without contradiction. She sounds, he said quietly, like someone worth knowing. She was, Cecily said. The clock on the mantelpiece struck 11. From somewhere far away, on the other side of several walls and a long corridor and a life she was no longer entirely certain she understood, the sounds of the party had gone almost completely quiet. Cecily set the letters carefully back in the collection and replaced the binding ribbon with hands that were steadier than she felt. She set the thin volume back on the shelf, slightly out of alignment, the way she had found it. She smoothed her skirt. I should return, she said. Yes, he said. She walked to the door. She stopped with her hand on the frame. Your Grace, she said correctly, this time precisely and without hesitation. She heard something that might, in a different man, have been the beginning of a laugh. "Miss Barrow," he said. She went back to the party. She did not look back, but she carried the warmth of the library with her all the way down the corridor, all the way through the bright, crowded drawing room, all the way out into the cold October night. She did not count anything on the carriage ride home. She simply sat and thought, and held her hands still in her lap, and looked at the dark fields passing beyond the window. Her mother, she thought, her mother had been here first. London talked. This was not surprising. London always talked. It was the city's primary occupation, practiced with greater dedication and considerably more creativity than anything else its inhabitants nominally did for a living. What surprised Cecily, when she returned to Barrow House the following morning and found her father already at his desk with 3 separate calling cards arranged in front of him like evidence, was the speed of it. Less than 12 hours, that was all it had taken. Lord Pemberton's secretary came by at 9, her father said, without looking up. Viscount Carey sent a note, and Lady Harcastle, do you know Lady Harcastle, has apparently told 3 people that the Duke of Ashford spoke to you at dinner. He said spoke to you the way other men might say discovered gold on the property, with a specific, barely contained excitement that had nothing to do with her and everything to do with what she represented at this particular moment: possibility, movement, the faint, intoxicating scent of upward trajectory. Cecily sat down across from him and folded her hands and said nothing. Well, her father said. He was courteous, she said. The dinner was long. Sir Edmund looked up for the first time. He studied her face with the brief, practiced assessment of a man who had spent 30 years reading contracts, and whatever he found there seemed to satisfy him, because he nodded once and looked back down at his cards. We'll accept Harcastle's invitation for Friday, he said, and you'll need a new dress. Cecily thought about her mother's handwriting, about firelight on old paper, about a man at the head of a table who had looked at 34 laughing people and quietly taken them apart. Of course, she said. She did not see the Duke for 9 days. In those 9 days, she attended 2 teas, 1 musicale, and a card evening at the Harcastles, that ran until midnight and produced, as far as Cecily could determine, nothing of any value to anyone except the hostess, who collected social debts the way other women collected porcelain. She wore the new dress her father ordered, pale gold, which was not her color and which she suspected had been chosen by someone who had never actually looked at her. And she smiled, and she was introduced, and she answered questions about Wiltshire with a patient, abbreviated version she had developed for people who asked about it but did not particularly want to know. She was, in other words, doing exactly what was required of her, and she was doing it with the specific, private knowledge of a woman who is performing adequately while thinking about something else entirely. Lady Fiona Ashworth was at all of it. Every tea, every musicale, every card evening. Cecily began to wonder if the woman slept, or whether she simply moved from event to event in her dark silk dresses, collecting information and distributing it with the efficiency of a postal service that had decided to specialize exclusively in damage. She smiled at Cecily each time, the same smile as at the dinner, bright, precise, measuring. Cecily smiled back. She was becoming very good at smiling back. On the 8th day, at a tea she had not wanted to attend, Cecily heard her own name from behind a closed door. She had stepped out of the drawing room to find a quieter corner, a habit, her particular survival mechanism in crowded spaces, and had settled herself near a window at the end of a short corridor when the door to her left opened briefly, then half closed, and 2 voices carried through the gap with the unguarded ease of women who believed themselves alone. The first voice she didn't know. The second she did. Nobody really, Lady Fiona was saying. The father is a baronet, which is something, but the family circumstances are. A small pause, a sound of dismissal, complicated. She seems quiet, said the first voice. She is quiet. That's the strategy, isn't it? Stand still and let the curiosity do the work. A brief, elegant laugh. The mispronunciation was an accident, obviously, but she's made quite a lot of it. The innocent country girl. The Duke has always had a weakness for novelty. Is that what it is? It's what it always is with him. Something catches his attention, he looks at it for a week, and then it sits on a shelf with everything else he's grown tired of. The voice shifted, slightly lower, slightly more deliberate. But there are other complications. Her mother, you know. What about her mother? There was a story, years ago. A situation that the family handled quietly, which is to say not quietly at all, only everyone agreed to pretend otherwise. A pause. I wonder if the Duke knows. And if he doesn't? Then someone, Lady Fiona said pleasantly, ought to tell him. The door opened fully. Cecily did not move. She was standing in plain sight. There was no pretending she hadn't been there, and Lady Fiona, emerging into the corridor with a teacup and the expression of a woman entirely unruffled by surprise, stopped and looked at her. A silence opened between them like a question. Then Lady Fiona smiled, wider than usual. "Miss Barrow," she said warmly, "I was just speaking of you." "I know," Cecily said. Something flickered in the other woman's eyes. Not guilt. Nothing so simple. Something more like recalculation, the momentary adjustment of a person who has just discovered that the piece on the board is not where they expected it. "I hope you enjoy the tea," Lady Fiona said, and moved past her down the corridor. Cecily stood at the window and looked out at the street below and thought, very carefully, about what she had heard. Her mother, a story, a situation. She did not know what situation. She did not know what story. What she knew was that Lady Fiona intended to use it, had perhaps already used it in other corridors at other teas, with other cups of tea and the same pleasant, unhurried smile. She thought about the letters in the library, her mother's handwriting. I pray she finds her way into the world more gracefully than I have managed. What had her mother meant by that? What had she needed to manage? On the 9th day, Cecily went to find Arabella. Not to the drawing room, where Arabella usually spent her mornings. Not to the small sitting room where she sometimes read. Cecily went directly upstairs, directly to Arabella's bedroom, and knocked once and opened the door without waiting for an answer. Arabella was at her writing desk. She closed whatever she was writing before she turned around, and the speed of it, the practiced, reflexive speed, told Cecily more than any answer would have. "What do you know about Mother?" Cecily said. Arabella was quiet for a moment. "Sit down," she said. "I don't want to sit down. I want you to tell me." "Cecily." Her sister's voice was not sharp. It was something else, something tired and old and worn in the way of a thing that has been carried for a long time. "Sit down, please." She sat. Arabella turned fully in her chair and looked at her with the expression of someone who had rehearsed this conversation many times in private and found, now that it had arrived, that none of the rehearsals had been adequate. "Mother," she said slowly, "was not from the family Father told us she was from." Cecily stared at her. "What do you mean?" "I mean that the story of her origins, the family in Bath, the respectable but modest circumstances, all of it was arranged. After the fact." Arabella folded her hands in her lap. "Mother was the illegitimate daughter of a man whose name I was told and will not repeat, because it doesn't matter, because he acknowledged nothing and left her nothing, and the only material evidence of his existence in her life was a small amount of money and a great deal of trouble." The room was very quiet. "Who told you this?" Cecily said. "Father, 3 years ago. He told me because I was about to accept a proposal from someone whose family would have investigated and found it first." Arabella's mouth thinned. "He didn't tell you because he thought it wasn't necessary, because your prospects were." She stopped. Because my prospects were what? Cecily said, with a calm that surprised her. Arabella looked at the window, because he didn't think it would come up. The particular cruelty of this, not intended, which made it in some ways worse, settled over Cecily slowly, the way cold settles when you have been standing in it long enough to stop feeling it directly and begin feeling only its effects. Her father had not told her because he had not expected her to need to know, because no one would investigate, because no one would look closely enough at Cecily Barrow of Wiltshire to find anything worth worrying about. Until now. Until a duke had silenced a room with a look, and spoken to her afterward in a library for 2 hours, and the whole of London had apparently decided this was interesting. Lady Fiona Ashworth knows, Cecily said. Arabella went very still. How? I don't know, but she does. Cecily stood up. She smoothed her skirt with both hands slowly, the way she had seen her mother do it, that gesture inherited without knowing, carried forward without understanding. She's going to tell him. Cecily, I need to think. She went to the window. Below, the street was going about its ordinary business, carriages, pedestrians, the gray London sky pressing down on all of it with patient indifference. She thought about the Duke's face in the library, the way he had said take it down about the letters, the way he had listened. She thought about what happened to women in her position when the stories about them reached the right ears before they could offer any account of themselves. She had watched it happen to others. She knew exactly how it went. And she thought, with a clarity that felt less like decision and more like recognition, like identifying something that had already been true before she named it, that she would not sit in this house and wait for it. She would not let Lady Fiona Ashworth carry her story to the Duke of Ashford second-hand, shaped and angled to do maximum damage. She would not give anyone that particular power over something that was hers. She had her mother's letters to return, in any case. That was reason enough. She turned from the window. I'm going to Ashford Park, she said. Arabella stood up from her desk. That is absolutely. I know what it is, Cecily said. I'm going anyway. Her sister looked at her for a long moment. Then something in her expression shifted, moved, like a curtain in a draft, to reveal something behind it that looked almost like recognition. Take the letters, Arabella said quietly. Whatever you found, take them with you. Cecily nodded. She left the room before either of them could say anything else that would make it harder. She arrived at Ashford Park the following morning. The same footman, the same enormous door, the same house making its usual statement against the October sky. But the drawing room this time was empty, and the corridors were quiet, and when the butler directed her to wait, she waited standing, not sitting, with the small bundle of letters in her hands and her spine very straight. The Duke came down the main staircase alone. He stopped 2 steps from the bottom when he saw her. Something moved across his face quickly, surprise, and something behind surprise that he controlled before it became readable. Miss Barrow, he said, I wasn't expecting. I know, she said. I need to speak with you before someone else does. A pause. He descended the last 2 steps. Then come in, he said. She told him everything. Not the arranged version, not the careful, managed account she might have prepared if she had been someone else, someone more practiced at this. She told him what Arabella had told her, and what she had overheard in the corridor, and what she had understood from her mother's letter in his library. All of it, plainly, in the order it had happened, without softening and without drama. He listened. He did not interrupt. When she finished, the room was quiet for long enough that she became aware of the clock on the mantelpiece again, marking time with the same patient indifference as the London sky. Lady Fiona, he said finally, has been a guest in this house many times. I know, Cecily said. She has also, he said, with a flatness that contained considerably more feeling than flatness usually did. Said a great many things in a great many corridors over the years that I have been informed of afterward, and wished I had been informed of sooner. Cecily looked at him. The question, he continued, is not what she knows or what she intends to do with it. Your mother's origins are not, he stopped, chose his next words with the care of a man who understood their weight. They are not a scandal, they are a circumstance, one that a great many people in this country share and a great many more pretend they do not. That is not how it will be presented, Cecily said. No, he agreed, it won't. He looked at her steadily, which is why I intend to present it differently. She didn't understand him, not yet. But the clock kept marking time, and outside the window the October light was doing something particular to the grounds of Ashford Park, something golden and almost warm, and Cecily stood in the middle of it all with her mother's letters in her hands and felt, underneath everything, underneath the anxiety and the exhaustion and the persistent, low hum of a world arranged against her, the same thing she had felt in the library 10 days ago. Something beginning. Something that had perhaps been beginning since the moment 34 people laughed, and one man did not. He did not tell her what he intended. This was, in the days that followed, the thing that occupied her most, not the visit itself, not the conversation, not even the particular quality of his attention when she had laid out the whole unguarded truth in front of him and waited for the verdict. Those things she could examine and set aside. What she could not set aside was the moment he had said, I intend to present it differently, and then looked at her with an expression that closed like a door, gently but completely, and offered nothing further. She had not asked. She had not known how to ask, how to frame a question that was really several questions at once, layered over each other like the pages of her mother's letters. What did he intend? What did asterisk differently asterisk mean in his language, in his world? And underneath both of those, the question she could not quite bring herself to the surface of. Why? Why did it matter to him at all? She had returned to Barrow House in the early afternoon, and Arabella had met her in the hallway with a look that asked everything without saying anything. And Cecily had said only, I told him, and gone upstairs and sat on the edge of her bed for a long time with her hands in her lap, and the feeling of a woman who has done something irreversible and cannot yet determine whether it was brave or simply reckless. Both possibly. In her experience, those were often the same thing. 3 days passed. She attended the things she was required to attend. She wore the appropriate dresses. She answered questions about Wiltshire. Lady Fiona was at 2 of the 3 events, a morning call and a dinner at the Percivals. And each time she smiled at Cecily with the specific warmth of a woman who knows something and is enjoying the knowing of it. And each time Cecily smiled back with the specific warmth of a woman who has decided to stop being frightened and has not yet worked out what to be instead. On the morning of the 4th day, a letter arrived. Not for her father. She knew this because she was coming down the stairs when it was delivered, and she saw the seal before the butler carried it to the study, dark blue wax, pressed with a mark she recognized from the library at Ashford Park. She stood on the 3rd step from the bottom and watched the study door close and told herself that it meant nothing, that dukes wrote to baronets about all manner of things, that there were 1,000 possible explanations that had nothing to do with her. She went to breakfast. She ate nothing. She drank 2 cups of tea and stared at the window and listened to the study door. 40 minutes later, her father called her in. Sir Edmund Barrow was standing when she entered, which was unusual. He was a man who conducted most of his business sitting down, in the manner of someone who had learned long ago that the ability to remain seated projected authority more reliably than standing. The fact that he was on his feet told her, before he said a word, that whatever the letter contained had moved him out of his habitual stillness. He looked at her for a moment. "Sit down," he said. She sat. He picked up the letter from his desk. He did not read from it. He held it, the way people hold things they have already read several times, and looked at her over the top of it. "The Duke of Ashford," he said carefully, "has written to me." Cecily said nothing. "He writes that he has become acquainted with your circumstances." Her father paused on this word, turned it over, set it down. "He writes that certain information has recently come to light regarding your mother's family, and that he wishes me to know that this information, in his assessment, reflects no discredit whatsoever on this family or on you personally." The study was very quiet. "He further writes," her father continued, in the tone of a man reading a map of terrain he has never visited and cannot entirely account for, "that he considers the matter closed, and that should anyone choose to present it otherwise in company, he will consider it a direct misrepresentation of facts and will address it accordingly." He set the letter down. "He signs it Ashford." Cecily looked at her father's face. She had learned to read it over 23 years, its specific vocabularies of approval and dismissal, and the vast, unremarked middle territory he occupied most of the time. What she saw there now was something she could not immediately classify. Not happiness precisely, something more complicated, the expression of a man recalibrating. "Did you know," he said slowly, "that he would do this?" "No," she said truthfully. "Did you speak to him?" A pause. "Yes." "About your mother?" "Yes." Her father sat down. He picked up the letter again and set it down again and drummed 2 fingers once on the desk, which was his particular signal of thinking rather than deciding. "He doesn't do this," he said finally. "Men like Ashford do not write letters like this. Not for," he stopped himself. "Not for women like me," Cecily said. He had the grace to look uncomfortable. "That is not what I said." "It's what you meant." He looked at her, really looked, the way he had at breakfast after the dinner, the way he occasionally did when she surprised him. And then, in the manner of a man who has been presented with evidence that contradicts a long-standing assumption and is not yet ready to abandon the assumption but can no longer entirely ignore the evidence, he said, "What happened at that dinner, Cecily?" She thought about the library, the firelight, her mother's handwriting pressing harder into the page for the final paragraph, the clock striking 11 and neither of them having noticed until it did. "He was courteous," she said. "The dinner was long." Her father looked at her for another moment. Then he nodded once and picked up the letter and placed it in the left-hand drawer of his desk where he kept things he intended to return to. Cecily excused herself and went upstairs. She was in her room, sitting at the window with no particular purpose, when Arabella came in without knocking, which meant Arabella had heard, which meant the letter had traveled through the house faster than Cecily had. "He wrote to father," Arabella said. "Yes." "Ashford wrote to father about mother's family." "Yes." Arabella stood in the middle of the room and looked at her sister with an expression that contained, in roughly equal measure, astonishment and something that might have been the beginning of alarm. "Cecily," she said, "do you understand what that means?" "He was being decent," Cecily said. "He knew Lady Fiona intended." "He was not being decent." Arabella's voice was not sharp. It was urgent, which was different and rarer. Decent men send a word through a mutual acquaintance. Decent men mention it quietly at a club and let it circulate. They do not write directly to a woman's father. She paused. "Not unless they intend something." The word, intend asterisk, landed in the room between them and stayed there. Cecily looked at the window. The October light was doing its particular thing again, golden, almost warm, the kind of afternoon light that felt like a conversation about something else. "He hasn't said anything," Cecily said. "To me, he hasn't." "Of course he hasn't. He wrote to father first, which is precisely the point." Arabella came to sit on the edge of the bed, the closest she came, generally, to urgency made physical. "Cecily, look at me." Cecily looked at her. "Be careful," Arabella said, not unkindly. "Not of him, perhaps, but of yourself. of what you are beginning to expect." She paused. "Men in his position have written letters before, have shown interest before. It does not always." "I know," Cecily said. "You know, and you're not listening." "I know, and I heard you." They looked at each other. The particular negotiation of sisters, the shorthand, the lacunae, the things understood without being said because they have always been understood without being said. Then Arabella stood up and smoothed her skirt and said, in an entirely different tone, "Wear the blue dress if you go out." "It's the wrong season," Cecily said. "I know," Arabella said. "Wear it anyway." The letter Cecily wrote that evening took 4 attempts. The first 3 she burned in the small fireplace in her room, watching the paper curl and darken and go to ash with the feeling of someone disposing of evidence. Not because they were wrong exactly, because they were too direct, or not direct enough, or direct in the wrong direction, aimed at the wrong target within the same general territory. The 4th she wrote quickly, before she could read it back and lose her nerve. She thanked him. She told him what the letter had meant to her father, which was to say what it had meant to the household, which was to say what it had meant to her, without saying that last part explicitly. She told him that she had been thinking about the library. She told him, and this was the sentence that had taken 3 drafts and a cold cup of tea to arrive at, that she did not know what he intended, but that she was grateful for the letter and for the dinner, and for the particular quality of his attention, which she had found, in her experience, entirely uncommon. She sealed it before she could revise it. She gave it to the footman in the morning before she had fully dressed, which was either decisive or unhinged, and she did not allow herself to think about it again until the afternoon, when a reply arrived. It was short. "Miss Barrow, I am glad the letter served its purpose. I find I am disinclined to let certain things go unaddressed when I have the means to address them. You asked what I intend. I intend to call on you Thursday if you will permit it. I intend to bring nothing with me except myself, which I am aware is a considerable imposition. I have been thinking about the library also." Ashford. Cecily read it twice. Then she put it in the left-hand drawer of her own writing desk, where she kept things she intended to return to, and she sat for a long time at the window in the October light, and felt something she had been very carefully not feeling for the better part of 2 weeks. She felt hopeful. It arrived without permission, the way hope usually does, sideways, through an unguarded moment, wearing the ordinary face of a short letter and a Thursday. She recognized it the way you recognize something you have met before in a different form. That particular warmth below the ribs, that particular quality of attention the future suddenly acquires when it contains something worth looking toward. She knew all the reasons it was too early. She catalogued them, as was her habit, the difference in their positions, the speed of things, the fact that a letter and a conversation and a silenced room did not constitute, in any reasonable accounting, a foundation. She knew that Arabella was right, that careful was the appropriate posture, that women in her circumstances had been here before, and found the view from this particular altitude did not always survive the descent. She knew all of this. She was hopeful anyway. Thursday came the way days come when you have been watching for them, both too slowly and suddenly all at once, so that, when the knocker sounded at 2:30, she had somehow been both preparing for it for days and entirely unready. He came alone. No secretary, no attendant, none of the social machinery that accompanied men of his position on formal calls. He wore a coat that was good without being ceremonial, and he carried nothing, as promised. And when she came into the drawing room where her father had somewhat unnecessarily installed himself with a newspaper he was not reading, the Duke of Ashford stood up from his chair and looked at her with the same expression she had first seen in the library. Attention, deliberate, unguarded just slightly at the edges. Her father stayed for 20 minutes and then remembered something urgent in the study, with the specific, unconvincing haste of a man who has decided to be tactful. They were alone. The fire was warm. The drawing room was smaller than the library at Ashford Park, but contained, at present, the same quality of quiet. "I have been thinking," the Duke said, "about what you said when you came to see me." "Which part?" Cecily asked. "The part where you told me the truth." He looked at the fire for a moment, then back at her. "I have had a great many conversations in a great many drawing rooms, Miss Barrow. People tell me a great many things, carefully arranged things generally, things positioned for effect." A pause. "You told me the truth because you thought it was the only useful currency you had left." Cecily considered this. "Yes," she said, "that's accurate." "It was," he said, "the most interesting thing anyone has done in my presence in quite some time." "That is either a compliment," she said, "or an indictment of your social calendar." "Both," he said, "unquestionably both." She looked at him, this strange, contained man who had silenced a room with a look and written a letter to her father about her dead mother's origins, and come to her drawing room on a Thursday with nothing but himself, as promised. "Why does it matter to you?" she said. "Genuinely, I would like to know." He was quiet for a moment. The fire settled. Outside, a carriage passed. "My mother died when I was 7, he said. "My father spent the remainder of his life in this particular variety of management, of being the Duke of Ashford, which is a performance, Miss Barrow, whatever anyone tells you, a very long, very demanding performance." He paused. "He was good at it, but I watched him for 20 years be good at it, and I watched what it cost, and I decided at some point that I would rather be honest about the cost than pretend it didn't exist." He looked at her. "Most people find that uncomfortable." "I find it," Cecily said carefully, "recognizable." Something shifted in his face. That loosening again, the one she had first seen in the library, when she had said she followed the quiet and he had said asterisk, "So did I, asterisk." "Yes," he said, "I thought you might." They talked for an hour and a half. Her father did not reappear. The fire burned low and was not replenished, and the light in the drawing room shifted from afternoon to early evening without either of them marking the moment it changed. When he finally stood to leave, he paused at the door, the same pause she had made in the library, hand on the frame, something unfinished in the air. "Miss Barrow," he said, "there is an event at Harcastle's on Saturday. I expect it will be very long and largely unnecessary." He looked at her steadily. "I would find it considerably less so if you were there." Cecily thought about Lady Fiona, about corridors and closed doors and smiles worn like armor, about her mother's handwriting pressing hard into old paper. "I expect I'll be there," she said. "My father is very fond of the Harcastles." "Good," he said. He left. Cecily stood in the cooling drawing room and looked at the door he had closed behind him and felt the warmth below the ribs again. Warmer now, more certain, no longer entirely without permission. She did not tell herself to be careful. She was going to be careful. She was also going to be hopeful. She was, she decided, entirely capable of both at once. Her mother, she thought, had managed it. She could too. The Harcastle drawing room on a Saturday evening held, by Cecily's count, 41 people. She counted them out of habit now. It had become, since the Duke's dinner, a kind of private ritual, the first thing she did upon entering a room, before she removed her cloak, before she located the fire or the nearest exit or the face of anyone she recognized. 41 people, arranged across 3 interconnected rooms that Lady Harcastle had opened for the occasion with the satisfied air of a woman deploying resources she had been saving for exactly this purpose. It was, by any measure, a significant gathering, the kind that would be discussed afterward in the particular, obsessive detail that London applied to evenings that had produced something worth discussing. Cecily understood this before she had been inside 10 minutes. She understood it from the specific quality of attention in the room, the way conversations paused fractionally when certain people entered, the way eyes moved and then moved away with a little too much deliberateness, the way the whole gathering seemed to be waiting, with varying degrees of patience, for something to happen. She found a place near the windows. Lady Fiona was already there. Not near the windows, near the center of the room, which was where Lady Fiona always positioned herself, the natural habitat of a woman who understood that the center of a room was a strategic location, rather than simply a geographic one. She was in dark red tonight, which suited her in the manner of a color that has been chosen with full knowledge of what it does, and she was speaking to a small cluster of women with the particular animated confidence of someone delivering information they have been holding in reserve. Cecily watched her for a moment, then she looked away. The Duke was not there yet. This was not surprising. Men like Ashford arrived when they arrived, and rooms rearranged themselves accordingly. What was surprising was how acutely she was aware of his absence, how the room had a different texture without him in it, how she had become, in the space of 2 weeks and a Thursday afternoon, someone who noticed the specific quality of a room that did not contain a particular person. This was new. She examined it the way she examined most new things, carefully, without judgment, turning it over to find its edges. Then the doors opened, and he came in, and the room did what rooms did when the Duke of Ashford entered them. He saw her immediately. She was certain of this, though he gave no visible indication of it, simply moved through the greetings and the handshakes and the various obligations of arrival with his usual contained authority, and found his way, by degrees, toward the windows. "Miss Barrow," he said. "Your Grace," she said, correctly, precisely, the 2 syllables landing exactly where they were meant to. Something in his eyes. "You've been practicing." "Relentlessly," she said. He almost smiled. She was becoming familiar with almost the specific geography of his face in the territory just before an expression fully arrived. She was beginning to find it more interesting than the expressions themselves. They spoke for a few minutes quietly about nothing of consequence, in the manner of 2 people who have already said the consequential things and find that ordinary conversation has become, as a result, considerably more comfortable. He asked about her week. She asked about his. He mentioned, briefly, a matter with his estate manager in Wiltshire that had required 3 letters and produced no resolution, and she offered an observation about Wiltshire estate managers in general that made him set down his glass and look at her. "How do you know that?" he said. "My father's estate," she said. "I managed the correspondence for 2 years while he was in poor health." "You managed the correspondence?" "Someone had to." He picked up his glass again. "Of course," he said, in the tone of a man making a private note. She became aware, gradually as these minutes passed, of a shift in the room around them. Not dramatic, not the way the room at his dinner had shifted, all at once, like a held breath released. This was slower. A reorientation, the specific collective adjustment of 41 people recalibrating their understanding of something they thought they already understood. She and the Duke standing at the window, talking for rather a long time. She became aware also of Lady Fiona. The dark red dress had moved. It was no longer at the center of the room. It was closer now, not close enough to be obvious, but close enough, angled in the particular way of a person who is listening without appearing to listen, and had arranged themselves with enough care that the arrangement looked accidental. Cecily did not look at her directly. Neither did the Duke. But something shifted in his posture, almost imperceptible, the kind of shift you would miss if you didn't know what you were looking for, and Cecily understood that he was aware of her too. Had been, probably, since he walked in. Then Lady Harcastle appeared at Lady Fiona's elbow and said something that made the cluster nearby laugh, and someone else joined them, and the conversation expanded, and Cecily thought perhaps she had imagined the listening, the angling, the too deliberate casualness of the positioning. She had not imagined it. She knew she hadn't, but she let herself half believe it for another quarter of an hour, because the alternative required a vigilance she was tired of maintaining. It was Lady Harcastle herself who ended that particular mercy. She was, by her own accounting, a devoted friend to everyone who came through her doors, which meant she was a devoted conduit of everything they said and did within them, not out of malice precisely, but out of the specific compulsion of a woman who loved people primarily as stories. She appeared at Cecily's side at the precise moment. The Duke had been momentarily drawn into a conversation with a man across the room, and she took Cecily's arm in a friendly, proprietary way and said, at a volume that was slightly too large for the distance between them, "My dear Miss Barrow, I must ask, is it true what they're saying about your mother's family?" The nearby conversations did not stop, but they thinned, the particular thinning of people who are performing inattention. Cecily looked at Lady Harcastle's face. It was bright and kind and entirely without guile, which was in some ways the most exhausting thing about it. "I'm not sure what they're saying," Cecily said pleasantly. "Oh, only that there was some question about the family line, on the maternal side." Lady Harcastle patted her arm. "I told them it was nothing, of course. These old stories always get so distorted in the telling." "They do," Cecily agreed. "Lady Fiona mentioned," Lady Harcastle stopped. Something in Cecily's expression, perhaps, or simply the arrival of a belated instinct for caution. "Well, in any case, it's all very old news, isn't it?" "Very old," Cecily said. "Entirely unremarkable." "Exactly what I said." Lady Harcastle moved on. Cecily stood very still and breathed slowly and looked at the middle distance and did not count anything, because she already knew the number. The story was in the room. Lady Fiona had put it there, not in one conversation, not loudly, but in the way that was most effective and hardest to counter, quietly, in pieces, in the guise of concern or confusion or old news that wasn't really news. By morning it would be in 3 other drawing rooms. By the end of the week it would have acquired details no one had actually known, and lost the caveats everyone had actually offered. She knew how this went. She had watched it happen to other women. She had simply never been the subject of it before. She was deciding, carefully, quietly, with the specific calm of someone who has moved past the stage of being frightened and arrived at the stage of being resolved, what to do next, when she became aware that the room had changed again. Not gradually this time. All at once. She looked up. The Duke was standing in the center of the room. He had moved there while she was looking at the middle distance, had excused himself from his conversation and positioned himself with a directness that was, she would later think, very characteristic of him. No maneuvering, no indirection. He simply stood where everyone could see him, which was the center, and he waited until the room came to him, which it did, because rooms always did. The conversations around her thinned again, then stopped. He spoke clearly, and without raising his voice, in the manner of a man who had never needed to raise his voice to be heard. "I believe," he said, "there has been some conversation this evening regarding Miss Barrow's family." The room was completely silent. Cecily did not move. "I would like to address it directly," he continued, "since it appears to be circulating indirectly, which is a method I find both inefficient and unkind." He looked around the room with an expression that was entirely calm and somehow, underneath the calm, very serious indeed. "Miss Barrow's mother was a woman of considerable character. I know this because my own father knew her, and my father was not a man who used that word carelessly." A pause, precisely timed. "The circumstances of her birth are not a scandal. They are a circumstance, one that speaks to the world's occasional cruelty and not at all to the family's merit." Another pause. I consider the matter closed. I suspect most of you will too." He did not look at Lady Fiona. He did not need to. The room understood. 41 people stood in the Hardcastle drawing room and understood, without being told explicitly, several things simultaneously. That the Duke of Ashford had chosen a side, that Lady Fiona Ashworth's particular campaign had been identified and declined, and that the woman standing alone by the windows in the blue dress was not who they had thought she was, or rather, was exactly who they had thought she was. Only the ledger on which she was being assessed had just been rewritten by the only person in the room whose pen carried sufficient weight. Cecily looked at him across the crowded, silent room. He looked back at her. Just for a moment, just long enough. Then someone near the pianoforte began to play something, and the room exhaled, and 41 people remembered themselves and their conversations and the necessity of appearing as though the last 2 minutes had been perfectly ordinary. Lady Fiona set down her glass and left the room. Cecily noticed this only peripherally. She was still looking at the place where the Duke had been standing before he turned back to his conversation, and she was thinking about her mother's letter, about the paragraph written with extra force, as though the words required more effort to commit to. About I hope she finds someone who sees not what she lacks, but what she carries. She looked down at her hands. They were not trembling. They had not, she realized, trembled once all evening. She did not speak to him again that night. He was occupied, and she was occupied, and the room between them was full of people navigating their own recalibrations, their own quiet adjustments to the new information they had been given. She accepted 2 glasses of wine and 3 conversations she did not particularly want, and 1 very earnest apology from Lady Hardcastle, delivered in a whisper, that she accepted with more grace than it deserved. When she collected her cloak to leave, a footman stopped her with a folded note. She opened it in the carriage. "Miss Barrow, I told you I intended to present it differently. I find I am not in general a patient man. There are, however, exceptions. Thursday, if you are willing. Ashford." Cecily folded the note and held it in both hands in the dark of the carriage and looked at the city passing beyond the window, lit and moving and entirely indifferent, and felt the warmth below the ribs again, wider now, less tentative, taking up space it had not previously occupied. Thursday, she thought. She was willing. She was, if she was being entirely honest with herself, considerably more than willing. She was, underneath the careful and the hopeful and the practical accounting of a woman who had been managing things alone for long enough to know the cost of miscalculation. She was, at the deepest and least defended part of herself, completely certain. She had been certain, she suspected, since the night 34 people laughed and 1 man did not. She simply hadn't had the courage to call it by its name until now. She looked out at the dark London streets and called it by its name. Then she put the note very carefully into her coat pocket, next to her heart, which was the least practical and most honest place she could think of to put it. The proposal came from nowhere. That was the thing about it, the thing Cecily would return to later, when she was trying to understand the sequence of events, and where exactly the ground had shifted beneath her feet without her noticing. It came from nowhere, which is to say it came from her father's study on a Wednesday morning, 3 days before the Thursday she had been holding in her chest like a quiet, private flame, and it arrived with the specific, efficient finality of something that had been arranged before she had any opportunity to be consulted about whether she wished it arranged at all. Sir Edmund called her in at 10 o'clock. He was sitting this time, which told her less than his standing had, and he had the expression he wore when he had made a decision, and was now engaged in the secondary task of presenting it in a way that would encounter the minimum possible resistance. "Sir William Graves has made an offer," he said, "for your hand." Cecily looked at him. Sir William Graves was 53 years old. She had met him twice, once at a dinner in September, once at the Harcastle's musicale, where he had sat beside her and talked about his late wife's rose garden for 40 minutes with a thoroughness that suggested the roses had been the primary love of the marriage. He was not unkind. He was not unintelligent. He was 53 and wealthy and in possession of a considerable estate in Shropshire, and he had looked at Cecily at the musicale with an expression she had noted and immediately filed under things to think about later, and then forgotten, because she had been thinking about other things. She thought about them now. When she said, "He wrote yesterday," her father said, "I have been considering it overnight. And I think you should accept." He said it directly, which she gave him credit for. He had always been direct, even when what he was being direct about was unwelcome. "Cecily, you are 23, Sir William is 53. Established. His estate is sound, his income is considerable, and he is, by all accounts, a decent man." Her father looked at her. Decent men in sound financial circumstances do not present themselves indefinitely. "No," she agreed, "they don't." "The Ashford matter," he stopped, started again more carefully. "Whatever the Duke's intentions may be, they have not been formally expressed, and until they are formally expressed, they are not real," she said. He had the grace to look uncomfortable again. "I was going to say uncertain." Cecily looked at the window. The October light was flat today, gray and non-committal, the kind of light that didn't do anything particular and didn't apologize for it. "How long do I have?" she said. Sir William would like an answer by the end of the week. 3 days. Thursday was in 3 days. She thought about the note in her coat pocket, Thursday, "if you are willing," and about what willing meant in the context of a man who had not formally expressed his intentions to anyone with the standing to receive them, which was to say her father, which was to say anyone who could make those intentions real in the particular, binding way that the world required them to be real before they counted as anything other than private warmth carried in coat pockets and hoping. She thought about Arabella's voice, "Be careful, not of him perhaps, but of yourself." She thought about her mother's letter, "I hope she finds someone who sees not what she lacks but what she carries." She thought about Sir William Graves and a rose garden in Shropshire and 40 years of a life, arranged around the practical and the sound and the certain. "I'll think about it," she said. Her father nodded. He had expected resistance, she could see had braced for it, the way he braced for Arabella's arguments, with patience and prepared counterpositions. Her quiet agreement disarmed him more effectively than any argument would have. She went upstairs. She sat at her writing desk for a long time and did not write anything. She went to Arabella. Arabella listened to all of it without interrupting, which was unusual enough to be its own kind of message. She sat in her chair by the window with her hands in her lap and her face very still, and when Cecily finished, she was quiet for a moment. "What do you want?" Arabella said. "I want Thursday," Cecily said, before she had decided to say it. "I know." Arabella looked at her. "And if Thursday comes and goes and he still hasn't spoken to father?" Cecily looked at her hands. "Then I will have my answer." "And Sir William?" "Sir William is a decent man." "That's not an answer." "No," Cecily said, "it isn't." She stood up. She smoothed her skirt, the inherited gesture, the thing carried forward from a woman who had managed things alone, who had found her way through a world arranged against her with as much grace as she could summon. She smoothed her skirt and she went back to her room and she thought, very carefully, about what she was and was not willing to do. She was not willing to send a letter. She had sent letters, 2 of them, and they had done what they could do and could not do more than they had done. She was not willing to present herself at Ashford Park a second time, uninvited, with her father's news and her private hope, and the specific vulnerability of a woman asking a man to hurry up and mean what she had begun to believe he meant. She had more pride than that. Not so much pride that she couldn't feel the pull of it, the longing to simply go and say there is a man in Shropshire in 3 days and I need to know. But enough. Enough to understand that some things asked for too directly become something other than what they were. She would wait until Thursday. If Thursday came. Thursday did not come. Not in the way she had been expecting it. On Wednesday afternoon, the day before, the day she had given herself over almost entirely to the private work of waiting without appearing to wait, Arabella came to find her in the garden with an expression that told Cecily, before she spoke, that something had happened. "Father received a visit this morning," Arabella said, "while you were out." Cecily went still. "Who?" "Lord Pemberton." Arabella paused, acting, apparently on behalf of Sir William, to inquire whether father had communicated the offer to you and whether a response might be expected before the week was out. "He sent an intermediary," Cecily said flatly. "He did. To accelerate the timeline." "Yes." She looked at the garden. It was a small, ordinary London garden. A few late roses, a stone path, a wall with ivy that had been allowed to do as it liked for long enough that reversing it was no longer a realistic proposition. "Father told him I was considering it," Arabella said. "He also told him that you," she stopped. "He told him that you were likely to accept." The cold came not gradually this time, all at once. "He said that," Cecily said. "He believes it," Arabella said carefully. "He believes it because he believes Ashford's intentions are uncertain and Sir William's are not, and in his accounting uncertain is the same as absent." A pause. "I think he is not entirely wrong." "I think," Cecily said, "that I need to go inside." She went inside. She went upstairs. She closed her bedroom door and stood in the middle of the room and breathed, slowly and deliberately, in the manner of a woman who has decided that she is not going to be afraid and is going to be angry instead, which is both more useful and considerably easier to maintain. She was angry at her father for deciding before she had answered. She was angry at Sir William for sending a man with a clock. She was angry at Lady Fiona, distantly, for the original sin of the corridor conversation that had set the board for all of this. And she was angry more quietly, more privately, and with a precision that was its own kind of information, at herself, for waiting, for holding a note in a coat pocket like a woman in a story who did not understand that stories required more than warmth to resolve themselves, for believing that Thursday was a promise when it was only an intention, and intentions, however sincerely held, did not arrange themselves into anything solid without someone doing the arranging. She sat down at her writing desk. She picked up a pen. She put it down again. She thought about what she would write and understood, clearly and without self-pity, that there was nothing she could write that would be better than silence. Either he would come Thursday or he wouldn't. Either the intention was real or it wasn't. A letter would change nothing about which of those was true. It would only reveal to him and to herself that she had not quite managed to be as certain as she had felt on the carriage ride home from the Harcastles. She was not willing to reveal that. She put on the blue dress. She went downstairs and told her father she was going to call on Lady Harcastle, which was not true, and she went out into the grey London afternoon, and she walked, which she did when she needed to think without her thoughts folding back on themselves, and she thought about nothing in particular and everything at once and arrived, 40 minutes later, at the determination that she was going to do something she had not planned to do. She was going to say yes to Sir William. Not today, not this afternoon, but by the end of the week, if Thursday came and went without anything that changed the arithmetic she had been doing since Wednesday morning. She was going to say yes because she was 23 and she was sensible, and she was not going to sit in a house waiting for a man who had given her warmth and attention and 2 carefully written notes, and had not, in any of these things, said the word that would have made the arithmetic unnecessary. She was going to be practical. She walked home in the gray light, and she was very, very practical all the way up the stairs and through dinner and into the evening. And she was still being practical at 9:30 when the knocker sounded at the front door, and the butler appeared in the doorway of the sitting room where she was reading a book she had not been reading, and said, "The Duke of Ashford, miss, he asks if you are at home." The book stayed open in her lap. She looked at the butler. "I am at home," she said, after a moment. After the moment it took to choose between the practical and the something else that had never entirely stopped being what it was. "Very good, miss." She stood up. She smoothed her skirt. He was in the hallway, which was where the butler had left him, had not presumed to install him in the drawing room without permission, which told her that he had arrived too suddenly for the ordinary machinery of the house to engage, that he had come without sending word ahead, without the careful social scaffolding that men in his position generally required and expected. He had simply come. He looked, she thought, like a man who had arrived somewhere after moving quickly and had not entirely caught up with himself yet. His coat was good. His cravat was straight. But there was something in the set of his shoulders, some slight displacement of the usual containment, that was not entirely usual. She came to the bottom of the stairs and stopped. He looked at her. "I heard," he said, "that Sir William Graves has made an offer." The hallway was quiet. Somewhere in the back of the house, ordinary domestic sounds, a door, a murmur, the distant percussion of an evening continuing without awareness of itself. "Yes," she said. "And that your father expects you to accept." "My father," she said carefully, "expects a great many things." He looked at her for a long moment. There was something working in his face, that quality she had seen in the library, the quality of a man who has been in complete control of himself for a very long time and is making a deliberate choice about how much of that control to set aside. "I should have spoken to him sooner," he said. He stopped. "I was being careful, which is, I am aware, a quality you do not need me to model for you." Something shifted in his expression. "I was afraid of moving too quickly and having you think I had not considered it, that I had not," he paused, "that I had not understood what I was asking." Cecily looked at him. "And do you," she said, "understand what you're asking?" "I am asking," he said, "for Thursday, and all the Thursdays after it. I am asking to speak to your father tonight, if he's in, about something considerably more specific than the letter I sent him about your mother." He held her gaze steadily, with the same quality of attention he had brought to every conversation they had ever had, the kind that did not prepare its response while the other person spoke, that did not look toward the door. "I am asking, Miss Barrow, whether you would consider being the Duchess of Ashford, with full knowledge that I am, as you have observed on at least 2 occasions, better at enduring things than enjoying them, and that I have a great deal of opinions about Wiltshire estate management, and that the last time I gave a dinner 34 people were unpleasant to someone I had not yet met, and would spend the following 3 weeks thinking about constantly." The hallway was very quiet. "3 weeks," she said. "At least," he said, "possibly longer, I lost count." She looked at him, this strange, contained, almost smiling man standing in her father's hallway on a Wednesday evening with his coat slightly askew, and his intentions finally formal and present and real. She thought about the library, about the letters, about the room at Harcastle's falling silent, about a note pressed against her heart in the dark of a carriage, about her mother's handwriting pressing hard into old paper and a prayer sent forward into a future she would not see. She thought about Sir William Graves and his rose garden in Shropshire. She thought about Thursday. "My father," she said, "is in his study." Something happened in his face. Not the almost smile. The actual one, unguarded, complete, arriving without the usual architecture of containment around it. She had not seen it before. She understood, looking at it, that not many people had. She thought it was the best thing she had ever seen. "Then," he said, "perhaps you would take me to him." She came down the last step. She did not take his arm. Not yet. They were not yet the kind of people who did that in hallways, without ceremony. But she walked beside him toward the study door, close enough that she could feel the warmth of him in the cold corridor, and she knocked once and opened the door, and her father looked up from his desk with the expression of a man who had been expecting Wednesday to be a perfectly ordinary Wednesday. It was not. It was, in fact, the best Wednesday in the recorded history of Barrow House, though it would take Sir Edmund a full 20 minutes, 2 glasses of brandy, and a conversation he had not remotely prepared for to arrive at this assessment. Cecily left them to it. She went back to the sitting room and she sat down, and she picked up the book she had not been reading, and she still did not read it, but this time it was for an entirely different reason. She sat, and the fire was warm, and the house was quiet around the murmur of voices from the study, and she smoothed her skirt one last time, gently, deliberately, like setting something down that she had been carrying a long way, and she sat with her hands still in her lap and felt, from the inside, what it was like when the arithmetic finally resolved. It felt like Thursday. It felt, she thought, like it had always been going to feel like this. 1 year later, the dining room at Ashford Park held, on the evening of the 14th of October, 37 people. Cecily counted them out of habit. She sat at the foot of the long table, her table now, in her house, in the life that had arranged itself around her with a completeness she still occasionally found surprising in quiet moments. And she counted 37 faces in the candlelight and noted, without particular effort, the ones that were different from last year. Lady Fiona Ashworth was not among them. She had declined the invitation, which had been extended as a matter of form, and accepted as a matter of course that it would be declined. Some things resolved themselves tidily. Lord Pemberton was there, Viscount Carey, Lady Harcastle, who had apologized to Cecily 3 more times since the Harcastle drawing room, and would likely apologize at least once more before the evening was out, which Cecily had made her peace with. Arabella was there, seated near the middle, laughing at something the man beside her had said, a man she had met 6 months ago, and looked at in a way that Cecily recognized and had not yet remarked upon, because some things were better allowed to arrive in their own time. Sir William Graves was not there. He had, by all accounts, found a perfectly agreeable match in Shropshire, and his new wife was reportedly very fond of roses. Cecily hoped she was happy. She meant it sincerely. From the head of the table, she felt him looking at her before she turned to confirm it. This had become, over the course of a year, one of the more reliable facts of her life. The specific awareness of his attention, the way it landed differently than anyone else's, the way it had always landed differently from the very first evening, across 34 laughing faces and a silence that had changed everything. She turned. He was looking at her. He did not look away. He held her gaze with the expression she had catalogued and returned to more times than she could count, the one that was warm, underneath everything, and unguarded at the edges, and entirely, specifically hers. She raised her glass very slightly. He inclined his head. At the far end of the table, someone was speaking to a new guest, a young woman recently arrived from the country, seated near the middle, looking at the grandeur around her with wide eyes and very straight posture, and the expression of someone trying extremely hard not to appear as overwhelmed as she was. Cecily watched her for a moment. She knew that expression. She had worn it herself in this very room, at this very table, 1 year ago tonight, the night she had followed the wrong corridor and found the right library, and said your grays to the most important person in the room and heard 34 people make a sound she would never entirely forget. She caught the young woman's eye across the table. She smiled, not the practiced smile, not the one she had developed for rooms that required managing. The real one, the one she had learned over the course of a year to use more freely. The young woman's shoulders dropped just slightly, enough. Somewhere to Cecily's left, she heard a whisper, an older guest leaning toward a newer one, voice low and amused. Whatever you do, don't mispronounce his title. Cecily looked down at her plate. She did not laugh. She did not need to. The warmth below her ribs was already there, familiar and unhurried and entirely at home, which was, she thought, exactly the right place for it to be. She looked up at her husband. He had heard it too. She could tell from the particular stillness of his expression, the almost, hovering just at the edges, not quite arriving. This time, she didn't wait for it. "Your grays," she said, very quietly for no one but him. The almost became real. She thought, not for the first time and not for the last, about a woman pressing words hard into old paper and sending them forward into a future she would never see. I hope she finds someone who sees not what she lacks, what she carries. She had. She did. Thank you for listening to the story all the way to the end. If you enjoyed one of our stories, let us know where you're watching from in the comments. And if you'd like to support the channel, you can join as a member or send a super thanks or super chat. Your support helps us continue creating more stories like this. Don't forget to subscribe for more stories.